To declare the Cold War over and declare democracy has won out over totalitarianism is a measure of arrogance and wrong-headedness. Alexander Haig.
Oh, hi! Mr. Lahasky here, and today we'll cover the final chapter of the Cold War. Throughout the 1970s, relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union was characterized by détente, a general easing of tensions that witnessed a lessening of hostilities, an abandonment of proxy wars, and a reduction in nuclear weapons on both sides. But by the end of the decade, many Americans were having second thoughts about cozying up with communists around the world. In 1980, they elected Ronald Reagan, who promised to renew the global struggle against communism and reassert American dominance globally. Today, we'll see how it all shook down. But first, a big question. Is the Cold War over? In 1991, the Soviet Union, which had stood as the bastion of communism for more than 70 years, dissolved. From the conclusion of World War II until this dissolution, the Soviet Union proved to be the main rival of the United States and its principal adversary in the Cold War. But did that Cold War end when the Soviet apparatus collapsed? Or did the ideological struggle between East and West simply take on a new form? Let's take a look. Our first big idea sets the stage for the Cold War's final chapter by discussing a change in American attitudes near the turn of the 1980s. During and after the presidency of Jimmy Carter, Americans began losing interest in détente. In 1980, they elected hawkish Republican Ronald Reagan, who promised to renew the global struggle against communism. You'll remember that following the mishaps in Vietnam, American presidents from both parties worked to ease tensions between the U.S. and Soviet Union. Republican Richard Nixon normalized relations with China and agreed to limit ICBMs through the first SALT Treaty. Upon taking over after Nixon's resignation, Gerald Ford acknowledged through the Helsinki Accords that communism was legitimate in Eastern Europe. And in the late 70s, Democrat Jimmy Carter agreed to another SALT Treaty with the Soviet Union. But by the turn of the 1980s, the memory of Vietnam was beginning to fade, and a contingent of Americans grew concerned that, if left unchecked, communism could still pose a risk to the United States and its allies. In 1980, Ronald Reagan spoke to these concerns. He painted Jimmy Carter as a weak president, highlighting his failure to secure the freedom of the hostages in Iran. Reagan emphasized the threat posed by the Soviets. In his acceptance speech at the 1980 Republican National Convention, he said, "When we move from domestic affairs and cast our eyes abroad, we see an equally sorry chapter in the record of the present administration. A Soviet combat brigade trains in Cuba, just 90 miles from our shores. A Soviet army of invasion occupies Afghanistan, further threatening our vital interests in the Middle East. America's defense strength is at its lowest ebb in a generation, while the Soviet Union is vastly outspending us in both strategic and conventional arms. Our European allies, looking nervously at the growing menace from the East, turn to us for leadership and fail to find it. Adversaries, large and small, test our will and seek to confound our resolve, but we are given weakness when we need strength, vacillation when the times demand firmness." And as the campaign against Carter intensified, Reagan continued to call for strength against the Soviet Union. Check out this campaign commercial that aired widely in the lead-up to the election.
There is a bear in the woods. For some people, the bear is easy to see. Others don't see it at all. Some people say the bear is tame. Others say it's vicious and dangerous. Since no one can really be sure who's right, isn't it smart to be as strong as the bear? If there is a bear.
Reagan's message against communism worked, and it helped to lift him over Jimmy Carter in 1980, making him just the third Republican to win a presidential election since the Great Depression. And as he had promised, Reagan renewed the struggle against communism worldwide. This is our second big idea. President Reagan escalated the Cold War by renewing the arms race and providing robust support to opponents of communism in Central Asia and Latin America. Reagan's hawkish approach to the Cold War manifested in a massive increase in military spending, reigniting the arms race that the presidents of the 1970s had attempted to put on ice. The Reagan administration spent billions on the development of new aircraft, naval vessels, and nuclear defense. Perhaps most interesting of these efforts was the Strategic Defense Initiative, a project that proposed the use of space-based satellites, lasers, and particle beams as a defense against Soviet ICBMs. Despite the fact that the concept itself was pure science fiction and never came to fruition, the Reagan administration sunk billions of dollars into research and development for the Pipe Dream project. In all, American military spending nearly doubled between 1981 and 1985. Aside from spending on the American military, Reagan also dedicated resources to proxy conflicts, most notably in Central Asia and Latin America. In Central and South America, the United States under Reagan supported a slate of authoritarian dictators on the belief that they were the best bulwark against communist uprisings. When one such uprising succeeded in Nicaragua, the Reagan administration supported anti-communist counter-revolutionaries known as Contras. To generate revenue for the Contras, the administration sold weapons to the Iranian government, the same government that had held American citizens hostage in Tehran only a few years prior. The transactions were carried out in secret, which proved controversial, not to mention illegal. But the Iran-Contra affair illustrated the Reagan administration's commitment to defeating communism around the world. Another proxy arena of the 1980s emerged in Afghanistan, which country the Soviets had invaded late in 1979. A number of Islamist groups in Afghanistan mounted a resistance to Soviet communism in the country, and those groups, known collectively as the Mujahideen, enjoyed robust support from the United States. Throughout the 1980s, the Reagan administration, as well as the preceding Bush administration, sent billions of dollars in aid and weapons to the Afghan Mujahideen. And thanks in part to U.S. support, the Muj were successful in repelling the Soviets from Afghanistan in 1989. Now, we should note here that U.S. support of Afghan rebels was not without its own set of consequences. The Soviet withdrawal created a power vacuum in Afghanistan, and a civil war soon broke out. Armed with American weapons, a Mujahideen group known as the Taliban seized power and instituted strict religious laws, many of which were extremely oppressive towards women. The Taliban also provided sanctuary for Islamist terrorist groups, including Al-Qaeda, led by 9/11 mastermind Osama bin Laden. But all that remains a story for another day. Now, whether the Reagan and Bush administrations could have foreseen the course of events in Afghanistan remains a point of debate. But their action in support of the counter-revolutionaries does undoubtedly represent a ratcheting up of Cold War involvement in the 1980s. After 5 years of rapid escalation in the 1980s, the Cold War entered its final chapter. This is our third big idea. The Soviet Union's 1991 collapse owed to a number of causes, including a reform-minded premier in Mikhail Gorbachev, political unrest among the member states, and the external pressure applied by the United States. After over 60 years of ironclad communist rule, cracks emerged in the foundation of the Soviet Union in the mid-1980s, leading ultimately to the collapse of the whole Soviet edifice. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Communist Party, the highest office in the Soviet government. Gorbachev favored economic and political reforms that he hoped would carry the USSR into the 21st century, but instead, their effect was destabilizing. Most noteworthy of these reforms were glasnost and perestroika, which together were intended to elevate political discourse and open certain sectors of the Soviet economy to private enterprise for the first time. But the loosening of communist restrictions led citizens across the Soviet Union to call for more reforms and even independence. By the late 1980s, the Iron Curtain that once separated Eastern and Western Europe grew ever flimsy as barriers between nations slowly came down, figuratively and literally. 1989 saw the fall of the Berlin Wall, which had sealed off West Berlin from the rest of East Germany since the 1960s. Then, in 1990, East and West Germany were finally reunited. Other Soviet satellite states followed suit in 1990 and 1991. And the United States did have a hand in the Soviet Union's collapse. The escalation of the arms race by the Reagan administration fueled an increase in military spending in the Soviet Union, despite its own economic woes. Some historians suggest that the billions wasted on the far-fetched strategic defense initiative may have actually tripped the Soviets into spending themselves into oblivion in an attempt to keep up with the United States. Furthermore, U.S. support of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan rendered that region a money suck for the USSR, and the Soviets' failure there paralleled the United States' shortcomings in Vietnam. In 1991, these political, social, and economic pressures proved too much for the Soviet Union to withstand. The satellite states declared independence, turned towards more democratic forms of government, and the Soviet Union collapsed, bringing an end, it seemed, to the Cold War. But did the United States actually win the Cold War? Or perhaps more pointedly, did the Cold War really end? The obvious answer is yes. After all, America's rival dissolved, the communist system proved a failure, and the United States stood seemingly alone as the world's hyperpower nation. However, we should note that even after the Soviet Union was a thing of the past, the United States faced, and continues to face, an ideological struggle with Eastern Europe. Though the Soviet Union dissolved, its power center, Russia, remained an intensely powerful and nuclear-armed nation. And the U.S. continues to face many of the same quandaries with Russia as it did with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Russia remains an expansionist and authoritarian nation that threatens the balance of power in Europe and has attempted to undermine the influence of the United States around the world. The U.S. and Russia have engaged in a number of proxy conflicts around the globe, including in places like Ukraine, Syria, Libya, and more. Recent evidence also suggests more direct attacks on American democracy through election interference and cyber warfare. So while the current struggle is not between capitalism and communism, the dichotomy between democracy and authoritarianism remains, as does the standoff between global powers. And for the time being, it shows no sign of subsiding. Next time, we'll shift our attention back to domestic politics and take a look at the age of conservatism. See you then.